The return to the moon has long been decided. But this time, it's not just about planting a flag in the dust. That should be clear by now. The plan is much bigger. It's about staying on the moon permanently. Not for a few days like with Apollo, but for weeks, months, and maybe even years someday. And that means we have to start building on the moon: roads, energy supply, transport vehicles, and living modules. And eventually, a complete infrastructure. Basically, we're talking about something that has never existed in the history of humanity. A small town on an alien world. And surprisingly, the moon landing isn't even the biggest challenge. My name is Serwin, and this is Mars Chronicles. Where do we build? First of all, in the next few minutes, we'll talk about the very concrete first steps that will be taken. I'll cover the topic of long-term infrastructure in a future video. If you look at the Apollo landings, you immediately notice a pattern. Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 all landed roughly in the middle of the near side of the moon. The reason was simple. They wanted to have the safest and simplest conditions possible. Flat terrain, direct radio connection to Earth to encounter as few surprises as possible. But that was the logic of the 1960s. Today, people are looking for something else. If humanity wants to live permanently on the moon, it needs resources. And one of the most important resources of all is water. Whether for manned or unmanned missions. That's why the Artemis architecture focuses on a completely different location: the lunar South Pole. By the way, that's also the goal of the coalition around China and the International Lunar Research Station, or ILRS, but more on that later. The south pole of the moon looks completely different from the regions where Apollo landed. There are massive craters, rugged mountain ranges, ancient volcanic structures, and extremely uneven terrain. And above all, permanent shadow regions. In some of these craters, sunlight hasn't reached the ground for millions or even billions of years. And that's exactly where scientists suspect there are large amounts of water ice. If you like this topic, feel free to give the video a like. That's really important so that it gets shown to more curious people like you and me. And if you haven't done that yet, feel free to subscribe and maybe consider supporting the channel as a channel member. Our members get to see the finished videos days and sometimes even weeks in advance. Thanks to all of you, and now back to the topic. NASA has identified 13 potential Artemis landing sites. All of them are located near the South Pole. What's interesting is that these sites are mostly not located inside the craters themselves, but rather on small sunny highlands, crater rims, mountain ridges, and slightly elevated plateaus. The reason for this is simple. These regions receive at least some sunlight from time to time. And so sunlight means energy, warmth, and better visibility. Right next to them are the deep shadowed craters where the ice is probably located. But that also means the surroundings of a future moon base will be anything but comfortable. Steep slopes, extreme shadows, and rough terrain. Before you even think about buildings, a much more fundamental problem has to be solved. Moon dust. The moon is covered by a thin layer of extremely fine dust called regolith. And this dust is anything but harmless. The individual particles are extremely fine, sharp-edged, and abrasive. You can imagine it like microscopic shards of glass. During the Apollo missions, this dust caused numerous problems. It scratched the visors of the astronauts' helmets, damaged the outer layers of the spacesuits, got into mechanical systems, and clogged radiators. With the lunar rover, dust accumulation even led to overheating problems because cooling systems were blocked. But it's even worse than you think. The moon has no atmosphere and only about 1/6 of Earth's gravity. That means if dust is stirred up, it can travel very far. The lunar dust is also electrostatically charged and sticks to almost everything. A famous example comes from Apollo 12. The mission landed about 180 meters from the unmanned probe Surveyor 3, which had landed on the moon a few years earlier. When the astronauts examined the vehicle, they found something surprising. Surveyor had been literally sandblasted. The cause was the dust that was stirred up by the engines when the Apollo lander touched down. And that was despite almost 200 meters of distance. Critical for the lunar base. With Apollo, there was a landing, a few extravehicular activities, and a launch back to Earth. With the lunar base, it would be completely different. There would be constant landings, launches, rover drives, construction work, and astronauts moving across the surface. Without countermeasures, every activity would create huge clouds of dust. But it should also be said that not every activity has the same effect as the launch or landing of a spacecraft. Nevertheless, it could damage instruments, contaminate solar panels, impair optical systems, and erode structures. Not to mention the health risks for the astronauts. That means, before houses can be built, a moon base needs something much more fundamental. Hard surfaces, roads, landing pads, and work areas. Because only when the dust is controlled can serious infrastructure even begin to develop. Without such reinforcements, every launch and every landing would create enormous clouds of dust that could endanger the entire environment. So the question is, how do you build roads on the moon? A surprisingly simple idea comes from a completely different context. The US military has been using a product for years with the nickname Rhino's Knot. The name sounds more like a bad joke, but it actually describes a pretty effective technique. It's a sprayable polymer solution that stabilizes loose soil. For example, it's used in desert regions to quickly create temporary roads, paved areas, and helicopter landing pads. This method was used especially often during the Afghanistan mission to reduce dust clouds during helicopter takeoffs. The principle is simple. The liquid is sprayed onto the ground and hardens. This turns loose soil into a stabilized surface. In theory, you could do exactly the same thing on the moon. But this solution has one major disadvantage. Everything would have to be transported from Earth. And that wouldn't just be expensive, it would also mean that we would literally be covering the moon with imported plastics. For a long-term moon base, that's hardly sustainable. That's why scientists are working on a much more elegant solution. Instead of bringing material to the lunar surface, they simply use the regolith itself, moon dust, which consists mostly of silicates, the same materials used to make glass. So, if you heat regolith enough, you can melt it and then let it solidify again. The result is a hard, glass-like surface. That's exactly what the European Space Agency, ESA, is working on in an experiment called PAVER. In this experiment, researchers used simulated moon dust and a powerful laser to melt the ground in a controlled way. The idea behind it is actually surprisingly old. As early as the 1930s, there were considerations to build roads in deserts simply by melting sand. On Earth, that was completely impractical at the time. On the moon, it could be exactly the right solution. However, a large laser would be quite a heavy device that would first have to be transported to the moon. That's why there's a second solution. And instead of artificial energy, you simply use the strongest energy source in the solar system. The sun? Specifically, you could use a Fresnel lens for this. This special lens consists of many concentric prisms that can focus light. It has the advantage of being flat, lightweight, and relatively easy to transport. With a Fresnel lens of just over 2 meters in diameter, you could concentrate sunlight so strongly that the lunar dust could also. However, there is a problem. At the south pole of the moon, the sun is extremely low on the horizon. That means long shadows, shallow light angles, and less direct energy. That's why it might actually be necessary to use both lasers and concentrated sunlight. As elegant as this method is, it's not fast. ESA has calculated how long it would take to build a single landing pad. A landing pad of 100 square meters and 2 centimeters thick would take about 115 days. That's about 100 times slower than paving a road on Earth. But on the moon, you have something that's often missing on Earth. Time. Interestingly, not all the time in the world, but all the time on the moon. A moon base will grow over years and decades, and during this time, a network of paved areas can gradually develop piece by piece. Once such roads exist, the next question arises. How do astronauts actually move around a moon base? With Apollo, it was relatively simple. Astronauts wore spacesuits and drove short distances with an open rover. It's not that simple. For a permanent base, that would be extremely inefficient. Spacesuits, however, are heavy, bulky, energy-intensive, and time-consuming. That's why completely new vehicles are currently being developed for the lunar surface. And one of the most exciting projects comes from Japan. Mobility on the moon, the Lunar Cruiser. Once a moon base exists, it won't be limited to a single location, quite the opposite. The most interesting resources, such as water ice, are often located several kilometers or even dozens of kilometers away. Scientific objectives can be even farther away. That means astronauts need to be mobile. Every time astronauts put on a spacesuit, a complex procedure begins, preparing the airlock, depressurizing, putting on the suit, and checking the systems. That alone can take hours. If you had to repeat that several times a day, most of the time would be spent on it. The solution is a completely new concept: pressurized rovers. Instead of traveling in spacesuits, astronauts move around in vehicles that are themselves pressurized. That means they can work and live normally inside, without having to wear a spacesuit all the time. One of the most interesting projects in this field is the Lunar Cruiser. This vehicle is currently being developed by the Japanese space agency JAXA together with Toyota. The Lunar Cruiser is basically a camper for the moon. It can accommodate 2 astronauts for a period of about 30 days, including life support systems, power supply, and workstations. The range of such vehicles could be several hundred kilometers. This would make it possible to venture far into the surrounding area from the base camp. The limiting factor here is clearly the provisions and the available breathing air. Another difference compared to the Apollo rovers is the energy source. While Apollo relied on batteries, the Lunar Cruiser is supposed to be powered by fuel cells. These use hydrogen and oxygen to generate electrical energy. The advantage here is the high energy density, relatively constant performance, and the byproduct is water. Especially in an environment where water is already a central resource, this could be a very efficient system. In addition, the rover is supposed to have extendable solar panels. Such vehicles serve several functions at the same time, somewhere between a means of transport, a mobile laboratory, and accommodation, just like motorhomes usually are. Astronauts could use them to carry out expeditions that last several weeks. In doing so, the vehicle would serve as a kind of mobile outpost. Inside, they could conduct scientific experiments, analyze samples, evaluate data, as well as sleep and eat. Only when they want to examine a specific location more closely would they leave the rover and perform an EVA. That significantly reduces the strain on both humans and technology. But at some point, the astronauts will also need to live somewhere. And this is where the next big challenge begins. A moon base doesn't appear overnight, even though a lunar night lasts 14 Earth days. At first, only a few people will be on the surface at the same time. For this first phase, NASA has already designed an initial habitat. Because before we talk about large lunar cities or underground bases, any long-term presence needs a first, relatively simple outpost. A kind of moon house, and that's exactly what NASA has already developed a concrete concept for. It's called the Foundation Surface Habitat. The name sounds rather unspectacular at first, but the idea behind it is pretty clever. This habitat is intended to be the first real accommodation for astronauts on the lunar surface and serve as a starting point for later infrastructure. It is designed to accommodate up to 4 astronauts at the same time. However, it's likely that not all 4 will always be in the habitat at the same time. The architecture of the Artemis program provides that most of the time, 2 astronauts will stay at the base while the other 2 go on longer exploration trips with a rover. The habitat, like the rover, also serves simultaneously as living quarters, a laboratory, a medical station, and a scientific center. And although it appears relatively compact at first glance, the interior is surprisingly complexly organized. The habitat consists of 3 levels, each serving its own function. The lowest level is a sturdy metal cylinder with a diameter of about 4 meters. This is where systems directly connected to the outside world are located. So, the airlock, spacesuits, equipment for extravehicular activities, and work areas for geological samples. Astronauts can examine moon rocks here before bringing them into the actual living area. This prevents dust and contaminants from entering the rest of the living space. The astronauts reach the second level via a ladder. Here is an inflatable area, an incredible module that unfolds after landing and expands the diameter of the habitat to about 6.5 meters. In this area, you'll find the hygiene facilities, exercise equipment, and scientific experiments. A particularly interesting feature is a biology lab, where researchers will study how plants and other organisms respond to the conditions on the moon. This is an important step toward long-term self-sufficiency. At the very top is the main living area. Here you'll find the sleeping quarters, a small kitchen, medical facilities, and computer workstations. There's also an area for human research. Because a moon base isn't just a place for geological experiments, it's also a gigantic medical experiment. The astronauts themselves become test subjects. NASA wants to understand how the human body reacts to longer stays on the moon, how muscle and bone structure change, and what long-term effects lower gravity has. These findings are crucial if we want to travel even further one day. For example, to Mars. However, the foundation habitat is only a temporary solution. It is designed for stays of about a month. If the moon base is to grow, much more robust structures will have to be built. Because the moon is not a particularly friendly place, astronauts have to protect themselves from several dangers there. Namely from cosmic radiation, extreme temperature differences, micrometeorites, dust, and erosion. A simple metal or inflatable module is not enough for this in the long run. That's why scientists are already working on the next stage of lunar architecture. And for that, they are turning to one of the oldest building methods in the world. Bricks. A look into history helps to better understand this new moon race. During the gold rush in the 19th century, most gold prospectors did not become rich. The big money was made by those who sold shovels and other tools, operated railroads, or built infrastructure. In the race to the moon, this exact pattern could repeat itself. Because if people want to work on the moon permanently, it will take much more than rockets and astronauts. It takes roads, landing pads, energy supply, habitats, and transport vehicles. In short, a complete industrial infrastructure. Numerous companies are already specializing in exactly that today. The small fish of today could be the sharks of tomorrow. Companies like Icon are working on printing buildings directly from moon dust, while Astrobotic and Intuitive Machines are developing landers and transport services for the moon. Other players like Lunar Outpost, Redwire, or Sierra Space are working on robotics, manufacturing, and habitat systems. Together with major players like Blue Origin and SpaceX, a completely new industry is emerging. An infrastructure economy for the moon, about 380,000 kilometers away from Earth, bricks, robots, and 3D printing. If humans are to live permanently on the moon, their buildings will have to be much more robust than the first habitats. Because the moon is an extremely hostile environment. There is no atmosphere there, no protective magnetosphere, enormous temperature fluctuations, and a constant danger from micrometeorites. During the day, the surface can heat up to over 120 degrees Celsius, and at night, the temperature drops to 170 degrees Celsius. In addition, there is cosmic radiation that hits the lunar surface practically unimpeded. A thin-walled habitat made of metal or fabric is not sufficient as a long-term shelter under such conditions. That's why space agencies are pursuing a concept that seems surprisingly simple at first glance. You build with the material that's already on site. with moon dust. The idea is relatively simple. Moon dust consists largely of mineral particles that can be solidified under high temperatures. If you heat regolith enough, you can sinter it, melt it, or press it into molds. The result is solid building blocks, basically moon bricks. With such bricks, you could cover habitats and thus build up a thick protective layer. Speaking of material science, when you see how scientists try to melt or sinter moon dust to build entire structures out of it, you realize just how fascinating modern manufacturing has become. And that's exactly why we tried something here in the studio. On the occasion of the upcoming Artemis 2 mission, we printed an SLS rocket, of course with our Poser Core 1. And I have to say, the result looks really brutally good. The details, the structure, the boosters themselves, the proportions of the rocket, everything comes out amazingly clean. That gave us an idea. Would you actually be interested in buying such models in the Mars Chronican shop? We're considering printing strictly limited editions for special missions. For example, an Artemis mission SLS rocket, a Starship model, or other rockets and spacecraft. Write it in the comments. Would you buy such a model, and how much would it be worth to you? We're talking about a model the size I'm holding in my hand here, so about 50 centimeters. If you do 3D printing yourself or want to get started with it, you'll find my affiliate link to Poser below in the description. And now back to the actual question. How do you actually build a base out of moon dust on an alien celestial body? Such a shell would have several advantages. It protects against radiation, it reduces temperature differences, and it provides an additional barrier against micrometeorites. The actual habitat, such as an inflatable module, would then be located inside. A kind of modern version of the old idea. First build a house, then put a protective wall around it. People themselves probably won't build these structures. At least not in the beginning, and even less likely the further we look into the future. The construction will largely be carried out by robots. Autonomous machines can collect regolith, heat it, form bricks, and then stack or print them. This reduces the risk for astronauts and allows construction work even when there are no people on the surface. A large part of the infrastructure could be built before the first long-term crews even arrive. Interestingly, China is already very active in this area. The Chinese Space Agency is working on a concept for 3D printed habitats called Lunar pod vessel. This is an egg-shaped structure that is supposed to be made partly from bricks using lunar soil. The construction would be carried out by robots and combines two technologies: traditional bricklaying and 3D printing methods. To find out how well such materials work, China has already launched an interesting test. In 2024, Chinese researchers produced bricks from 5 different simulated lunar soil mixtures. These samples were then heated and hardened using 3 different methods, but the actual test is not taking place on Earth. In November, these bricks were sent to the Chinese space station Tiangong. There they were attached to the outside of the station. Now they are exposed to the conditions of space for several years. That means vacuum, cosmic radiation, and extreme temperature changes. After about 3 years, the researchers want to examine how much the material has changed. The results could be crucial for how future moon buildings are constructed. Besides bricks, there's another rather unusual idea. An American company called Skyports has presented a concept as part of a NASA research program that sounds like science fiction. The idea: lunar dust is heated until it becomes a viscous glass mass. Then this mass is inflated with pressurized gas, similar to glass blowing. This could create a huge glass dome, because the advantage on the moon is that there is hardly any gravity and no atmosphere. Structures can therefore be much larger than on Earth without collapsing immediately. Additionally, you could create multiple layers of glass with air gaps in between, similar to modern insulated windows. Whether this idea will ever be put into practice is still up in the air, but it shows how creative the concepts for future lunar architecture have become. All these structures, however, have one crucial thing in common. They only work if there is enough energy. And this is exactly where a lunar base encounters another problem. On the moon, the sun does shine brightly, but not all the time. To be precise, only half of the time. But not like here on Earth, roughly 12 hours, but in a 14-day cycle without electricity, nothing works on the moon at all. No air systems, no communication, no scientific instruments, and absolutely no heating. And this is exactly where a problem arises that hardly anyone on Earth is aware of. The moon has an extremely long day-night cycle. A lunar day lasts about 29.5 Earth days. That means about 14 days of sunlight followed by 14 days of darkness. For short missions like Apollo, that wasn't a big problem. The astronauts were gone again after a few days, but a moon base has to function continuously. And 2 weeks without sunshine are a huge problem for traditional solar energy. Many moon missions have used solar panels so far. That basically works well as long as the sun is shining, but as soon as the long lunar night begins, the temperatures drop extremely fast. Many rovers and landers simply freeze, and unfortunately, most of them never wake up again. Even if they start up again after sunrise, the batteries and electronics are often permanently damaged. For a permanent base, this risk is simply too high. The Artemis program is focusing on the moon's south pole. And that's exactly where the energy problem becomes even more complicated. Many of the most interesting scientific targets are located in craters that never see sunlight. These so-called permanent shadow regions have remained dark for millions or even billions of years. Scientists suspect that there are large amounts of water ice there. The ice is extremely important. It can be used for drinking water, oxygen, and even rocket fuel. But these exact regions are completely without sunlight. Solar energy simply doesn't work there. That's why NASA has been working on another solution for several years: nuclear reactors on the moon. The project is called Fission Surface Power. Basically, it's a small nuclear power plant that's being specially developed for use on other celestial bodies. The basic principle is the same as with a reactor on Earth. Uranium atoms are split. This generates an enormous amount of heat. This heat is then used to generate electrical energy. On Earth, heat from nuclear reactors is usually used to turn water into steam. The steam then drives turbines. In space, it doesn't work that easily. Water is a valuable resource. That's why the concept relies on a different technology, specifically the Brayton converter. In this process, heat is directly converted into mechanical energy, which in turn generates electricity. The system is compact, efficient, and also works in a vacuum. NASA has clear requirements for these lunar reactors. They must weigh no more than about 6 tons and be roughly the size of a car. That's extremely small for a nuclear power plant. But for a lunar base, this output is sufficient for now. A single reactor is supposed to provide about 50 to 100 kilowatts of electricity. That's about as much energy as 30 to 40 single-family homes use. For a small outpost, that's more than enough. One of the most interesting candidates for this project is a company that many people associate more with luxury cars: Rolls-Royce. But Rolls-Royce doesn't just make cars. The company has been developing nuclear reactors for British submarines for over 60 years. This experience makes the company an ideal partner for compact reactors. Their current concept envisions a micro-reactor that fits exactly into the power range NASA needs. Such a reactor could completely supply a small lunar base with energy, and if the base grows, you simply place several reactors next to each other. The first outpost of humanity. When all these technologies come together, something completely new emerges. Roads made from melted moon dust, rovers that travel across the surface for weeks, habitats protected by regolith walls, and a small power plant that supplies a base with energy. That would be more than just a new mission. It would be humanity's first permanent outpost beyond Earth. A place from which we can venture deeper into the solar system. To Mars, to asteroids, and maybe one day even farther. And maybe that's exactly where the greatest significance of the moon base lies. Not the moon itself, but what it makes possible. If we learn to live on another world, we've taken the first step into a future where humanity is no longer a single planet species. My name is Sirwan, and this was Mars Chronicles. Thank you for tuning in. Per aspera ad astra. Additionally, you could create multiple layers of glass with air gaps in between.